this kind of argument in the literature. One thing that comes close is a few remarks in the work of Uriah Kriegel, who sometimes takes it as a starting place for a theory of consciousness, that we need to explain the sense of self, the sense of subject that's present in every experience. And Kriegel himself has developed a particular theory of consciousness that's designed to capture this basic intuition. Now, his theory of consciousness, which I won't describe in detail, is basically a reflexive theory of consciousness. The idea is that every perceptual representation or other item of which we're conscious simultaneously represents a feature of the world and itself. So if you're seeing an apple, you have a visual state that represents an apple, but that visual state also represents itself, and consciousness arises when these perceptual states become self-representational. And he thinks it's this self-representational feature that brings in or accounts for the phenomenal I. But just to quickly remark on this, it's not at all clear that mere reflexivity is enough for I-ness. If a representation represents itself, it's not clear that it brings in anything I-like. There are certain words that do this. So for example, you could say that the word short describes itself, since it's a short word. And if you think about that, it's not clear that the word short, which represents other things and itself, thereby brings in some sense of Cartesian subjectivity. So it's not clear why Kriegel's mechanism should bring in any sense of I-ness or me-ness, as he sometimes puts it. But also, the very intuition that Kriegel bases his theory on is a phenomenological appeal to a sense of I-ness and thought. And that's exactly the intuition that Hume doubts. That's exactly the intuition that I want to invite all of you to doubt. And if you're skeptical at all about introspection, as I hope the last hour and a half has convinced you to be, then this kind of brute appeal to what we find obvious from introspection should be regarded with a certain degree of skeptical caution. So I don't think any argument that takes as its starting place an assumption that we can experience a self is going to solve the debate. We'll just get into a clash of introspective intuitions here. We need to move beyond that. Now, one person who moves beyond that is this guy. This is Immanuel Kant, who celebrated a birthday in the last couple of weeks. So did Hume, by the way. They're both very, very old. Now, Kant brings up the self in one of the central parts of his most famous book, the First Critique, or the Critique of Pure Reason. It's one of the most difficult, trenchant parts of the First Critique, a part that has incited much debate and has been subject to multiple interpretations. And it's certainly not my goal to engage in any serious Kant scholarship here. So what I'm going to do is sort of pretend. I'm going to give you a sort of a very simple rendition of one interpretation of one of the things that might be going on in Kant's argument. So if you disagree with this interpretation, I'd love to hear your interpretation. The key question is, can we read in Kant any argument for the presence of a phenomenal I? And I think there is one reading on which one might find that, and here's how the reading goes. Now, the portion of the critique that matters is a portion that's called the transcendental deduction, and here, your eyes may roll over for the next couple of minutes, but here's the basic gist. Now, Kant thinks about the senses as delivering what he calls a manifold of sensations. That just means a collection of different sensations. So you're looking at an apple and feeling it, and you see the color and the shape, and you feel the texture on your fingers. You have all of these different sensations. That's the manifold. But the manifold, which is just this collection of different sensations, is not yet a recognition of this object as an apple. To do that, you need to know that the co-occurrence of these different experiences, the redness and the roundness and the glossiness of the skin, are what apples are like. So what you do is you bring these different sensations under a concept, under the concept of applehood. So ordinary perception involves bringing sensory experiences under some concept, and the concept is something that's kind of an inferential relation that tells you that when you get red and round and shininess all together, then you've got an apple on your hands. It's possible to see in this idea a kind of unity that emerges once we bring a concept to bear on experience. all of these different sensations are sort of free-floating, they're independent of each other. But the concept brings them together. It says the redness and the roundness are not separate independent things, but belong to a single object. And it's only when a concept is introduced that you get a unity in perception and start to experience these things as part of a single object. That's Kant's view. Now, the self so far hasn't been mentioned, but the interpretation that's suggested by some of Kant's remarks in this discussion is that in order to achieve this conceptual unity, there needs to be what Kant calls a transcendental unity of apperception. There needs to be a self there that's doing the binding together, that's uniting all these things together. And you can see that in both space and time. So if you see circularity and roundness, or circularity and redness, you see the stem of the apple and a leaf maybe, bringing all these things together that are presented to you in different regions of space is part of what's going on when we place the apple under a concept. In time, you might look at the apple from one perspective, then from another. You might see only part of the apple at a first glance, another part on a second glance, and you need to integrate these two consecutive experiences together. That unification in time, like the unification in space, requires an application of concepts, and Kant thinks it's a self that's doing it. You need a self that's the same throughout these regions of space, a self that remains the same throughout time, in order to apply a single concept to what would be otherwise completely isolated bits of perception. So the self comes in as the great unifier. So Kant's view can be said, the self is not something that's, in some sense, a separate element, like an item or an object in experience. It's rather the unification itself. The experience, the phenomenal experience of a self, is the experience of different sensory bits coming together as a coherent whole. It's the self that creates conscious unity. So the self is experienced as a unification in perception. So this view, I think, would make Kant smile. It's an easy trick. I'm just in close proximity to Kant's armpit, which I tickle with my foot. Now, what I want to say about the Kantian approach is that I think we can explain the unity of perception without the eye. So if I'm right to read Kant as saying the eye is required to create unity in perception, then I think our objection to Kant has got to be that there's another way to explain the unity of perception without the eye. And here what I want to do is just appeal to contemporary work in cognitive science that's tried to offer accounts of the unity of perception. If our best account of the unity of perception does not introduce an eye, then this Kantian argument for the presence of an eye in experience won't succeed. I just want to remark here that it's not obvious in Kant himself that the eye is supposed to be something that's phenomenally felt as opposed to something that's beyond experience. So I don't want to commit too strongly to a particular reading of Kant. I just want to say, if you think Kant is an argument for the eye being experienced, this is something like how the argument would go, the argument that I just presented. Okay, so is an eye needed to explain the felt quality of unification in consciousness? Now, one of the most influential contemporary theories of the unity of consciousness in contemporary cognitive science is this one. It says that the different bits of experience get unified together because the underlying brain states fire at the same frequency. Now, brain states, when a neuron or population of neurons is active, they don't just turn on and stay on. They sort of flicker on and off. They pulse with electrical chemical activity. And the basic idea is that if you have two different parts of your image that are unified, the way you recognize or experience them as unified is that they pulse at the same time if they're parts of the same object. So the cylindricality present in this picture of a Coke can and the color are processed in different parts of the brain. And the puzzle is, how does a shape area and a color area lead to a single unified experience of a red cylinder? Answer, cells in the shape area are firing at the same rate as cells in the color area. And it's the co-occurrence of these that leads to an experience of the two as unified. Now, I actually don't think, as stated, this theory of unity will succeed. So this is really an extended footnote. I think there are various